Welcome back to the Law News Network. Who you just heard from was Karen Bobo. This was the mother of Holly Bobo, and she was providing her victim impact statement. And what we know is usually this victim impact statement is provided during the death penalty phase. However, as a part of the agreement with taking the death penalty off of the table, and Zachary Adams receiving life without the possibility of parole, plus 50 years served at 100%. Karen Bobo was able to provide her victim impact statement, and boy, was it an impactful statement. She was very calm, and her message was delivered in an incredible manner. We have Dr. John Huber on the line with us, who is a forensic psychologist. Dr. Huber, thank you so much for being with us this morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on.
And you know that we just heard from Karen Bobo, who is the mother of Holly Bobo. As a psychologist, take us through the emotional toll that Karen Bobo is experiencing while she's on the stand at this point.
Well, first thing I'd like to say is, man, she has amazing strength.
Yes.
The ability to stand there and talk about her daughter and calmly, actually very peaceably, talk to the person who was responsible for her demise and to address him rationally, and it was very moving. I mean, I have a daughter myself. I work with nurses. As soon as I get off here, I'm going to go back doing hospital rounds with my nursing staff, and the amount of internal fortitude she has is amazing. You know, because she's gone through the loss, she's gone through the hatred phase where she's been angry and frustrated. Now she is at an acceptance phase, and she stated her husband, the first time in 6.5 years, smiled last night for the first time.
Right.
You know, this has got to be a lifting of a burden off of their shoulders, and they have to be commended for their ability to do this.
Absolutely. Now, we know that from it, and partially in listening to her testimony, but obviously hearing from the different witnesses and the evidence that was presented throughout the trial, we know that the Bobos were unable to, bury their daughter at the time that they found out that she was missing, and then found out that she was dead. They had to hear about how her body was dismembered. They were not able to properly bury their daughter. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, when you go through it, that helps give you closure
Mm-hmm.
and to know what happened to your daughter. You know, first thing, the daughters are supposed to be burying their parents.
Right.
And so they had to go through that whole process, and then they had to wait, and then when they finally got to inter her body, they had to sit there for another several, years until they actually prosecuted, and they had to sit here and listen to how these people disrespected that body, and it showed their true sociopathic tendencies. And again, I have to commend them to how peaceful they are. I don't know if I could be that way.
Right, and you brought up a great point. You talked about sociopathic tendencies. Tell us a little bit about the characteristics of a sociopath and how that may have come to play in this trial.
Well, surprisingly, one of the main characteristics of a sociopath is when you meet them, you feel like they're your best friend,
Hmm.
but you don't find out anything about them. You just give all your information over to you. That allows them to manipulate you and to set you up. And then there's absolutely no remorse on the side of the sociopath. Their value of you is what can they get from you, and then once they get that, you're useless to them.
Right.
And I think as you listen to the testimonies and how they proceeded, I didn't hear people saying, "Oh man, I felt horrible about this." It was, "This is what we did. This is
Right.
what we did next." We had to hide all the evidence, and you know, their statements between themselves saying, "Yeah, she'll disappear and nobody will ever know anything. This will be the last we ever hear of her." That that is part and partial to that whole sociopathic tendency that they definitely are demonstrating.
And how does taking drugs, or specifically in this case, opioids, how does that affect the mental stability of an individual who may or may not be, be a sociopath?
Well, again, when you start adding drugs into things, you never are thinking clearly on those drugs, whether it's alcohol, opioids, marijuana, and like that. Opioids in particular, though, tend to blunt and stop that affect regulation thing where we're like, oh my goodness, I feel sorry for somebody. If you have ever had extreme chronic pain and they put you on opioids, the pain doesn't really go away. You just don't care about it anymore. So if they have those sociopathic tendencies, odds are it's just going to magnify those and make that situation even worse.
Now, throughout the trial, we also know, and we actually heard police recordings or statements from actual family members who had actually called the police on, I believe it was Zachary Adams, due to his violent tendencies. Is this something that I would like for you to explain to our viewers? Does violence for a sociopath just slowly build, or is it something that can just happen just like that?
Well, it really depends upon the type of sociopath you have, but the ones that are successful in doing their bad deeds tend to have that explosive type where everything's going along fine. The people who get to know them, though, the family members who have to live with them, they see it all the time. They see that quick temper because they're with them 24/7. So the families reporting and the people who live with them reporting the violence, that's a normal process. But then the people outside the family talk about how it just explodes all of a sudden. That's also normal too, because there's two different sides to that coin.
Okay. Now, let's talk about, and I'm not sure if you were able to see Zachary Adams in the courtroom while the verdict was read. We know from his attorney, Jennifer Thompson, that she informed us that after or prior to the verdict being read, she had a feeling that the verdict was going to come back guilty. And they discussed preparing for the guilty verdict. And I want to say, advised him to attempt to remain calm. However, as a psychologist, in these types of situations, is it possible for an individual to just remain calm and stoic as he was? Or does it have something to do with the fact that he may have some mental issues in being a sociopath?
It could be mental issues and being a sociopath. At the same time, there may be part of him that was in a belief cycle that thought he was going to somehow not get the consequences he got, and so he may actually been in shock. A lot of times when people go into shock, you get absolutely no response from them, and it's not really about their personality type. Based on his behavior, based on how things were going, I have to believe he had an inclination of what was happening, and what you were seeing was just someone very well controlled. And he's probably really good at that, being that sociopathic type person.
Okay. Now, in addition to that, we know that the investigators were investigating an individual by the name of Terry Britt. Terry Britt, we know, had a lot of prior history with sexual assault. And they really harped on him and investigated him. They looked through his home several times, but they were unable to find anything. When we saw from Terry Britt on the stand, we saw that his demeanor was not one of an individual who was well prepared, and in my opinion, he came off a little sketchy. Now, an individual who has prior history with sexual assault, what goes on in the mentality of an individual who has issues with sexual assault? Tell us a little bit about that so we can get into the mind of Terry Britt a little.
Typically, sexual assaults aren't about the sex, they're about the power they have over people. And this is someone who, by that disorganization is evidencing that he probably doesn't have a lot of natural authority, or people don't often look up to him for advice and things like that. So he takes his feeling of superiority out through sexually assaulting victims, people that are weaker than him. And I think watching that testimony is evident that he's not someone who is has a strong ego and can easily stand up to questioning, they tend to fall apart. And again, he's looking for that missing part of his personality at the expense of victims.
Okay. Now, you said that, and that this was a great point that you brought out, that the issue with the sexual assault is the power over the individual. Now, we know that Zachary Adams now has been found guilty of all charges, and it was alleged that he raped Holly Bobo prior to murdering her. Is this the same kind of situation?
Could be possibly with his anger. He may, have had some kind of crush on her. I don't know. I don't remember exactly how their relationship was before this. If he knew her, if this was just happenstance. But there's several different possibilities, and I would have to, I think, sit down and talk with him to be able to point you in any different direction. But if we look at the different options, one of them is that is somehow in his mind he had a relationship with her and she rejected him, so he was taking that. And with those sociopathic tendencies, it didn't bother him to hurt somebody that he thought he liked. Or it could be purely just, hey, she's a target and I'm going to violate that because I can.
Right. Now, in regards to, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but Shane Austin was also a defendant in this case. However, he committed suicide prior to the case coming to trial. Now, I want to talk a little bit about individuals who are in prison, and well, not in prison, who are in jail awaiting trial, who commit suicides. Do you find this often, or do you see this often in your practice?
I don't see it often in my practice. I go and visit individuals in different jail settings and meet with them. And whenever we feel that there may be a risk, we obviously put them on eye contact where we watch them, have somebody sitting there right next to them during that phase. So it's not unheard of. I've heard of some interesting ways that individuals have attempted suicide in jail. But it's always a concern, especially when the evidence is so strong against somebody and they feel like life is not going to be bearable. You get someone who's had a sexual assault, raping, and you go into a jail setting, a prison setting, and the inmates are not going to be your friend.
Right. And tell us, you talked about the risk that the alleged defendant, or the alleged assailant, excuse me, being at risk. What are some of the factors that determine that someone is actually at risk?
Well, if they have a weak sense of self, a weak ego, it sounds like Austin was kind of a follower in this situation. He wasn't the leader. He wasn't the strong person in there. And, you become your own individual when you get in the prison system, and it's very hard to stand up for yourself. So that's one of the things. Somebody who has a weak sense of self, someone who sees that the alternatives are worse than death. That's another one, and he was in a situation where that can easily be understood that may be a bad situation for him. And the other side to it is he may be in a situation where he thinks, I'm gonna beat everybody to it. I'm not gonna give them the gratification of sentencing me and finding me guilty. So there's a few things that are going on in that mind, I think, that we will never know, but possible.
Right, and that's an interesting point that you brought up. Now, is this sort of a guilty mind, or a mind that I don't think, no matter what I do, I don't think that I'm going to get out of this situation?
I think a little of both. I think Austin, probably wasn't the hardcore sociopath that we just saw today, and he was feeling shame and remorse for that, and that's one of the reasons why that becomes an option, that suicide becomes an option.
Okay. Another thing that I do want to talk to you about is Clint Bobo, who is Holly Bobo's brother. We've heard from his testimony that he was actually the last person to see Holly Bobo, and he saw her being led into a wooded area by an individual who was wearing army fatigues. Now, how does that, well, before I ask you my question, I'm sorry about that. We also learned later that his mom, when he informed his mom as to what he had seen, his mom told him to go and get a shotgun and just shoot the individual. And he stated that he did not do that because he was in a confused state. Being that his sister, now we know that she was murdered, how does that play mentally on his mind? How does that affect him as her brother?
Well, he's experienced a devastating loss, and he probably feels somewhat responsible. If he'd have done something at that moment, he was the last person to see her. Could he have done anything? I'm sure that plays in his mind all the time. And then he has to face his family. So I imagine that he's got some issues with some guilt, probably some depression that he's probably hiding pretty well from what I've seen. But I would recommend in his situation that he would try to find a therapist and somebody, even if he doesn't need it right now, I can see him needing it in the future.
Okay. What we're going to do now is we're going to throw to a clip of Terry Britt. And what we'll do is once we are able to view his testimony, we'll talk about his demeanor on the stand a little.
Yeah.
Parsons, Tennessee.
And who did you live with?
Janet Britt.
And that's your wife?
Yes, ma'am.
And how long have the two of you been married?
I think we got married in 2004.
Do you remember hearing, and you have a shoulder injury, right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And I'm just saying that because I see you rubbing in case they're wondering what's going on. Do you remember hearing that a young lady by the name of Holly Bobo had come up missing from her parents' home there in Parsons?
Yes, ma'am.
Prior to hearing that news, did you know Holly Bobo?
No, ma'am.
Did you know Dana Bobo?
No, ma'am.
Karen Bobo?
No, ma'am.
Clint Bobo?
No, ma'am.
Any of their family?
I ain't never met none of them.
Had you ever been to their home on Swan Johnson?
Not that I know. No, not that. No, ma'am.
Right. And where did you and your wife, what road did you and your wife live on?
Jeanette.
Jeanette.
Jeanette Holly Road.
Okay. Now, is that close to John Holiday Road? Or do you know? Like a little cut-through road?
I don't know.
And that's the right answer. If I or anybody asks you something that you don't know, just tell us.
Okay.
Okay? So after you heard that Holly Bobo was missing from her home, did you know that you would immediately be someone that law enforcement would look at?
Yeah, I've heard it.
And that's because of your history?
Right.
Right. Despite having that knowledge, or with that knowledge, do you remember law enforcement coming and interviewing you about Miss Bobo?
They pulled up in the driveway that morning. Me and my wife just got there and unloaded the tub. We went to Camden and bought, and we just got through unloading it. And they pulled up in the driveway there and asked me where I'd been.
And you were with do you remember what time of day it was? And if you don't, it's okay.
I don't know what time they pulled up, no, but I mean, no, that morning.
The morning that it happened?
Mm-hmm.
And at the time that they pulled up, you were actually there with your wife, unloading some,
Yes,
you were
ma'am.
remodeling the bathroom?
Right.
Okay. So after that day, were you aware that law enforcement had tapped your telephones?
No, ma'am.
Were you aware that for the first time in the state of Tennessee, they had actually bugged your house?
No, ma'am.
Were you aware that they were conducting covert surveillance? You know what I mean by that?
I have no idea.
And you know what I mean by that? In other words, watching you when you didn't see them.
I didn't know it. I didn't know they were, no.
Do you remember, or did they come and actually search your house at some point?
Yeah.
Did they search your outbuildings or attack your garages, sheds, that kind of thing?
Well, see how they do it. They come up with a couple of charges so they could hold me in jail all day.
Right?
And they went out to my house, and from what I hear, they blocked the roads off, set up a crime scene out there.
Let me ask you this, so you weren't present when they actually searched your house?
No, I was in jail.
Okay. And to explain that for the jury, you were on parole for one of your previous convictions,
No,
correct?
I was not on
Or
parole.
probations?
No,
Nothing?
no.
All right. So was this over the reporting of your job?
Yes,
Okay. And I'll do my best to ask questions that make sense. Were you working as a contractor for the newspaper there in Parsons?
yes, ma'am.
Okay. And is that something you were supposed to report?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. That was not under the table work, though. You were actually a contract laborer for the newspaper, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And had you reported that to the person you were supposed to report it to?
Yes, ma'am.
And in the end, that person failed to report it up the chain, is that correct?
She wouldn't write it down. She said that I didn't have to, that contract labor didn't have to be
Had to be reported.
put down. And I told her several times, and she just kept saying, "Don't worry about it, I got this."
Right. And ultimately, when they found out, she backed you up, didn't she?
Yeah.
She
Mhm.
admitted you had reported it.
Yes, ma'am.
But despite that fact, you had to do how much time on that?
3 months in jail, 9 months probation, about $1,000 fine.
Welcome back to the Law News Network. We just heard testimony from Terry Britt. Terry Britt was an individual who the state had originally investigated in regards to being the actual assailant in this crime, but in the murder of Holly Bobo, excuse me. However, we ultimately found out that later on down the line, the investigators realized that they were treading down the wrong path. So, Dr. Huber, we still have you on the line, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Okay, and so I know that you heard from Terry Britt. His demeanor on the stand, I know that we talked about that a little bit, regards to someone who, commits the acts of sexual assault and the power that they have over individuals because they feel powerless themselves. From what you saw of his demeanor on the stand, how did you think that he fared?
Well, I think he did, like most of us would do, trying to think back 6.5 years ago, and how people, ask you what time, did something happen? When did they question you? But at the same time, you saw him fidgeting. He also, when I advise people to go who are going on trial, I advise them to dress up, dress the part. This is a serious thing. He's wearing a T-shirt. He's demonstrating through these nonverbal communications his eye contact. He kind of goes back and forth to different individuals in the courtroom that he's not really certain what he should be doing and why he's even on trial, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I do have to point out to you, I'm not sure if you knew, but he is serving time for another crime. So
okay,
that's
so,
part of the reason
so
why
that
he was there in the T-shirt. Yes, but you provided some great commentary for us today. Dr. Huber, thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you very much.
Have a great one.
Afternoon.